Greetings and welcome to Genocide Awareness Day 2021 here at San Jacinto College North Campus. Today, we acknowledge and participate in raising awareness about genocide. In the wake of the horrors of the Holocaust, mankind said never again. Since the 1948 adoption of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, however, we have seen genocide go unchecked and unchallenged. In 1975 through 1979, the Cambodian genocide, the 1981 through 1983 Guatemalan genocide, the 1994 Rwandan genocide, the 1995 Bosnian genocide, the 2003 Darfur genocide, the 2016 Yazidis genocide, and the 2018 Uyghur genocide. Therefore, today we do not forget the Armenians. Today we honor the never again cry of the Holocaust. Today we honor the victims of all genocide. When we discuss genocide, we must go back and understand where this word came from and what is it. Raphael Lemkin, an international lawyer, in his attempt to understand what happened to the Armenians during World War I, he asked, why is the killing of 1 million a lesser crime than the killing of a single individual? In his 1944 book, he created the word genocide, which is a combination of Greek and Latin. Greek, genos, for group or tribe, and side for killing. He developed the word to assist to understand the atrocities that the Armenians experienced, and later he applied this term to the Holocaust. Lemkin's efforts, though, did not just end with this new definition. He went on and he worked in the United Nations to produce the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which is the international law regarding genocide, and it often provides the standard definition for scholars. The convention lays out crimes and acts of genocide. In Article 2, it states that genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. So the following acts are killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group's conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcefully transferring children of the group to another group. So these are the acts and crimes of genocide. And Raphael Lemkin, he pushed this convention through. And today we have with us Lori Garcia, who is the Assistant Director of Education Outreach at the Holocaust Museum, Houston. In this role, Lori manages the Educator in Motion program, a free school program that supports Holocaust, human rights, and social justice education in pre-K through 12th grade classrooms, and assists with the creation of lesson plans, curriculum, resources, and training for educators. She earned her BA in history from Texas A&M University and her MA in Holocaust and Genocide Studies from Stockton University. Prior to joining the museum, she worked in the field of early childhood education as an educator and family advocate. Lori, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yes, thank you so much to San Jacinto College for the invitation to be a part of this special day of remembrance. We're truly honored to be here today to highlight the importance of genocide awareness and the struggle for human rights in contemporary society. So I'd like to share my screen with everyone, again, as a part of our discussion today. But I'd like to start by providing more information about the mission of Holocaust Museum Houston. So Holocaust Museum Houston is dedicated to educating people about the Holocaust, remembering the 6 million Jews and other innocent victims, and honoring the survivors' legacy. Using the lessons of the Holocaust and other genocides, we teach the dangers of hatred, prejudice, and apathy, hoping to utilize this knowledge to transform our communities and our broader world today. And as a part of Genocide Awareness Day, of course, the history and legacy of genocidal atrocities throughout the world is very important to us. We actually recently underwent an expansion of the museum and now have a human rights gallery on display where we talk about the evolution of human rights, genocides in the 20th century, and actions that individuals can take in the world today to support the cause of human rights, freedom, and justice for all individuals. So I'd like to begin by starting a little bit more about genocide. So unfortunately, genocide didn't begin with the Holocaust. We see genocide interwoven throughout history. So even though the word genocide itself is new, the concept and practice of annihilating populations and groups based on their identities is ancient. The picture that you see here highlights newspapers and headlines documenting many of these atrocities. So when scholars reflect on this history, they can see genocide in many areas of the world that stretch back all throughout time. Many scholars refer to the Roman and Greek massacres as acts of genocide. Many scholars also point to colonization and the murder of indigenous peoples as crimes of genocide. And then more contemporary, before the Holocaust begins, we even have research about the Herero genocide in Africa and the Armenian genocide in the early 1900s. So unfortunately, the practice of annihilating entire populations can be seen all throughout history. So as the Holocaust ended, the world was horrified by what they had seen happen. Newspapers and eyewitness testimony, film, and documents started coming out, highlighting many of these atrocities. And the world came together to make a promise, a pledge that never again would we allow innocent people to be murdered simply because of who they are or what they believed in. So a world organization came about, the United Nations, and they tried to find a remedy to prevent genocide from occurring again. So they started to create committees, documents, and treaties to help support the rights and freedoms of everyone in the world. One of the documents that's most important for our conversation today is in 1948, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide was documented. So in this document, it's our first legal definition of what genocide is, and now we can actually bring perpetrators to justice, because before, government leaders could essentially do whatever they wanted to their people within their borders because they were making the rules, the policies. There were no international laws that could actually hold them accountable. But with this document, it was a watershed moment in history where we could now bring these perpetrators to trial and find justice for the victims. So in the infographic that you see here is a map of all of the different countries that have signed on to the Genocide Convention and have ratified it, again, abiding by the rules and regulations established here. So again, this convention was created in 1948, and there are currently 152 nations that are signed on to this treaty, with the United States ratifying the document in 1988, and Guatemala, which will be focusing on later in the presentation, ratifying the document in 1950. But unfortunately, even though we have this very important treaty and document in place, genocide continues to occur. As you see in this map here, genocide can be found on every continent of the world. Massive populations were targeted and affected by these atrocities. So again, we see the proliferation of genocide continuing even after the Holocaust ends. And in this graphic here, you can also see the active genocides and politicides that have occurred around the world. So again, the huge numbers of people and countries that are impacted by this. So again, why do we continue to see genocide occur? What motivates a political leader or a government to engage in these atrocities? A lot of scholarship has been written about this, and many people point to the following points about why genocide occurs. First, a political leader may engage in genocide as a way to eliminate a real or perceived threat. So again, they're using mass murder and atrocities as a way to establish power and maintain control, eliminating any opposition to their rule. Genocidal leaders also commit these acts of genocide as a way to acquire economic wealth. For example, taking over land, resources, or even enslaving the local population to benefit their economy. They also use genocide as a way to spread terror, as a way to keep people in line to follow their orders, to kind of dismiss any opposition to their rule. But you also see genocidal leaders using these acts of crimes to implement a belief, a theory, or an ideology, a vision of how they want to rule their country and see things moving forward. So it was alluded to before, but now that we know a little bit more about how, again, we see genocide occurring throughout the world in huge numbers and why these genocides occur, I'd like to focus our attention again on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide, 1948. So again, this is the first legal document that lists what genocide is and what it looks like. So in the first part of Article 2, it has who is protected under this convention. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, either in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about this. So we have 4 categories listed here. You cannot be targeted because of your nationality, your ethnicity, your race, or your religion. So again, for it to be considered a genocide, individuals have to fall into one of these 4 categories. So a lot of scholars actually think that this is a little bit limited in its definition because many genocidal leaders commit acts of genocide against groups that are not included here, but are identity based. For example, targeting people because of their political beliefs or ideologies, targeting people because of their abilities, their sexual orientation, or other identities. But again, for it to be classified a legal genocide, it has to fall into one of these 4 groups. So for the Holocaust, had this convention been in place, the Jewish community would have protected because they are a religious group, but according to Nazi ideology, they were also perceived to be a racial group. But again, even though this definition is a little bit limited, it's a starting point to, again, hold perpetrators accountable. We also have, if you move up, with the intent to destroy. For it to be genocide, you have to prove that leaders intended to destroy this community because of their identity. And so for many times, it's very hard to prove cases of genocide because this evidence is destroyed. A lot of the communications are done verbally or in secret, so there's no evidence left over, or a lot of the documentation is destroyed, as we see happening towards the end of the Holocaust. But again, as we'll allude to a little bit later in the presentation, there are activists that use a lot of really creative methods and scholarships and research as a way to prove that genocide occurred against a targeted community. We also have here the words, it has to be genocide to target one of these 4 groups with intent, either in whole or in part. So when we think of the word in whole, a lot of people think, if you think of a percentage, 100%, the entire community needs to be destroyed. But oftentimes that's not what actually happens in genocide. Even destroying a portion of that population is detrimental to that group's survival. So for example, during the Holocaust, we have about 6 million Jews that were murdered. In other genocides, we see about 80 to 90% of the population murdered. So again, even destroying a group to such an extent that it's almost impossible for them to recover what they had lost, or it would take a really long time for them to recover to what they were before, is considered a genocide. But some people use this as a way to deny that genocide occurred. Their arguments are it's not a genocide because this community still exists. But again, in the court of law, it still can be considered a genocide to destroy a portion of this population, again, detrimental to their survival as a group. And so now I'd like to move on to some of the different actions that constitute genocide. So again, this is what genocide actually looks like on the ground. So first we have killing members of the group. So again, this would be the intentional murder of people from that targeted population. During the Holocaust, we see this happening in a variety of ways. So massacres where Jewish communities are rounded up, shot and buried in mass graves. We even have the murder of Jewish individuals and other targeted groups, but particularly the Jewish population, in gas chambers or in other killing centers where people are murdered. And we see this replicated many times throughout many instances of genocide. We also have B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of this community. So again, this can mean causing such harm to a community, either to mind, body, or culture, that it's hard for that culture to continue on. So for example, this could mean the destruction of religious sites, destroying their religious texts or cultural symbols, not allowing them to practice their culture, traditions, language, or customs, again, to such an extent that that culture is destroyed in the long run over time. So again, even harming a culture is considered to be an act of genocide. I'd now like to move on to point C. It's a little bit wordy, but it basically means forcing the group to live in an area where they cannot physically survive. So during the Holocaust, we also see this happening in various ways. Ghettos were not constructed as a way to keep Jewish communities alive. They were not giving them access to the same resources, opportunities as the surrounding community. They were forced to live in areas where they were not given access to food, water, medicine, or resources. Thousands of people every day were dying of disease, hunger, and illness. And as a result, the community was diminishing and destroyed over time. So some examples of this that we'll actually see later in the presentation could mean by bombing villages, destroying the land so it can't produce food anymore. It can also mean destroying access to clean water, again, making those areas unlivable and forcing individuals to relocate, or again, forcibly displacing them. Even the construction of concentration camps as a way to concentrate individual and not giving them the means to survive is considered an act of genocide. And you also have D, something that's also not talked a lot about when most people think of genocide. Genocide can also mean preventing births within that group. For example, this can mean the separation of families. So in the concentration camp setting and in many other acts of genocide where men and young boys are murdered, leaving only the women and young children to survive, separating families, so placing men on one side, women on another side, not allowing that group to grow and have children, even targeting children so they can't grow up to be adults is considered genocide. And unfortunately, as many of these things happen, we also see sexualized violence against women, again, causing such harm to their body that they cannot produce anymore, and causing disruptions in the community. So again, even sexualized violence can become a weapon of genocide throughout this time. And finally, we have E. So this means forcibly removing children from that community and placing them in a new environment. So in this case, this would be, for example, many people point to the residential schools that were created throughout North America and in other areas, for example, Australia, where Indigenous communities are forced to go to schools where they're not allowed to practice their culture, religions, their customs. A lot of their identities are erased, or they're forced to take on new identities as a part of that. And so over time, if cultures are not allowed to flourish and continue, this knowledge and these customs are lost over time, and it can't be passed on to future generations. So we have many of these instances happening where children are taken away from their families and their communities and forced to take on new identities. So again, this kind of gives us an overview of what genocidal violence looks like in action. But as a part of that, we also see the 10 stages of genocide occurring. And this was great research that was conducted by Dr. Gregory Stanton from Genocide Watch. That's a great organization that talks about genocide throughout history, but also gives the world leaders and community members warnings about potential genocides that are occurring in the world right now. And based on his research, he developed the 10 stages of genocide. Again, these warning signs to let individuals know that genocide is underway. So all of these stages don't have to happen in order. You can even have multiple stages happening at the same time. It also doesn't have to go in order. You can move from one stage to another. And again, I just want to highlight some of the different stages that we see happening during this violence. So first you have classification, essentially labeling individuals based on their identities and creating an us versus them environment. You also have the creation of symbolization, forcing members of that community to wear symbols of their identity, the most famous of which is during the Holocaust, forcing Jewish individuals to wear the yellow Star of David or the armbands, again, labeling them as Jewish individuals. In Cambodia during the Khmer Rouge, again, individuals that were forced to wear symbols of their identity. And we even have from Eastern Europe, the blue scarves in Bosnia. You also have discrimination. So again, this is kind of like legal laws that are created to take away the rights and freedoms of a community. For example, during the Holocaust, we have Jewish individuals that are denied their social, economic, and political freedoms. Jewish individuals were not allowed to go to school, go to swimming pools, operas, clubs. They couldn't interact with people outside of their so-called racial group. They were banned from many different professions, eventually not even allowed to own their own businesses, which were taken over or Aryanized by the government and Nazi sympathizers. So again, this is the introduction of laws that suppress basic human rights and freedoms from that targeted community. And this is also very important and key to what happens during genocide, this idea of dehumanization, using language to take away the fact that a community or a group, that they are human beings, that they are people, that they deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. So you have a lot of really negative stereotypes and terms that are used to talk about these communities. In Rwanda, during that genocide, Tutsis were referred to as cockroaches. During the Holocaust, Jews were referred to as vermin. And finally, as a lot of these things continue, we have organization and preparation. So again, making plans and policies to implement the murder of individuals on the ground and the persecution of these groups. And finally, we have extermination, when we see the mass murder and human rights abuses against these targeted groups. And I'll talk a little bit more about denial later on, but that's the last stage of genocide. After the atrocities have been committed, or even in the midst of these crimes, denial that genocide is actually occurring, or spreading misconceptions about what's occurring on the ground to kind of hide the fact that they are committing genocide, again, blaming it on other influences. So again, now that we've highlighted a little bit more about genocide throughout history, what genocide means, what it looks like on the ground, and how it occurs over time, I'd now like to focus on Guatemala. So we're going to be discussing the genocide of the indigenous Mayan community during the 1980s, which was the peak of the violence. So Guatemala is a very beautiful mountainous country that's located in Central America, and it was the heart of one of the world's greatest civilization, the Mayans. But over time, with the collapse of the Mayan Empire, colonization, as well as Inquisition campaigns, their population was decimated. As the centuries passed, the Mayan people continued to experience inequality and human rights abuses through economic exploitation, land seizures, and the denial of basic resources within the country. Throughout the 1900s, Guatemala became embroiled in civil war with political leaders and groups vying for power and economic resources. But in 1944, Guatemala experienced a shift in the nation's politics, which was called the 10 Years of Spring. So between 1944 and 1954, the country's leaders made greater efforts to support the rights and freedoms of the Guatemalan people, particularly the indigenous population, and made great strides towards equity and equality. However, backed by foreign assistance, including the United States, the government was overthrown in 1954 and a military dictatorship was established. Civil with various coups taking place throughout the years, with the Guatemalan people caught in this very violent conflict. And which brings us to the case of genocide, again, the height of these atrocities on March 23rd, 1982, which again would usher in the height of these genocidal atrocities and human rights abuses. General Efrain Rios Montt, who you can actually see here in the center of this photograph, and a handful of other officers staged a successful coup and took over the government. He became the head of a three-man military junta who would lead a campaign of destruction and genocide against the indigenous Mayans. So as a part of their rule, they began to target subversives and those they considered to be enemies of the state. For example, those with communist ties and guerrilla movement associations. As a part of their struggle to maintain power and control, they also targeted peasants, university and secondary school teachers, students, union leaders and members, catechists, and community members who supported the guerrilla movement. But a majority of the victims that were targeted throughout this time period were the indigenous Mayans, who were perceived to be, by the government, supporting the guerrilla movement. And we also see the Ladino community facing massive repressive actions throughout this time period. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of the genocidal atrocities that occurred in Guatemala throughout the 1970s and 80s. For example, as a part of their Scorched Earth campaign, the military and government would go into villages and bomb them from the air. They would also destroy land and crops. Water supplies were contaminated. So again, community members had access to no clean water, and homes were burned down, again, making it almost impossible for them to stay there and causing massive forced displacements. So if you can see in this map here, the triangle is actually the Ixil region where many Mayan communities were living and where a lot of this violence was concentrated. So this is a map of 1979, and you can see the geography here. So again, these are villages where acts of genocide occurred. Again, predominantly, they were Mayan communities. So the red here represents areas that were vegetated during this time, but not in 1986. So again, highlighting the fact that a lot of these villages are being destroyed and burned down. There's no vegetation there. And this comes from the research of Russell Shimmer from Yale University. Again, highlighting that genocidal atrocities occurs because this wouldn't happen in normal circumstances. It wouldn't be an environmental factor that would cause such catastrophic loss. You also see two satellite images from a closer area as well. So again, this was an area populated by indigenous Mayans as well, villages. So this map here on the left is from 1986. So this was right after the peak of a lot of these atrocities. So you see that the purplish color here represents areas where vegetation has been cleared. So again, the land can't really produce crops or provide resources to the community. So you see how extensive this damage is. And again, the deliberate policy of targeting these Mayan communities. And in 2000, you see that some of the land is becoming useful again. You see the purple kind of like decreasing in area, but again, Guatemala is still recovering from this devastating loss. You also see two maps here, again, highlighting how devastating the scorched earth policy was, especially throughout the reign of General Efraín Ríos Montt. So in 1979, again, a lot of the atrocities are occurring, but it hasn't reached its peak. You see two Mayan villages listed here. So the red represents land that's healthy. Again, it's able to produce much vegetation, but after the peak of the violence, you see that a lot of the land has been destroyed and can't produce crops anymore. So again, how targeted these campaigns were. And Efraín Ríos Montt also famously denied that a lot of the actions he was committing was genocide. So he stated, "We have no scorched earth policy. We have a policy of scorched communists." So again, how devastating and targeted this policy of campaign was. But again, a lot of the victims were the Mayan communities that were perceived to be supporting the guerrilla movement. The military believed that they were providing them shelter, giving them resources and food to continue on the struggle. But again, many of these communities had no involvement, but again, were destroyed as a part of this process. Not only do we see the destruction of land and making these areas physically destroyed to the point where people cannot survive there, we also see massacres of Mayan villages occurring. So these two photographs that you see here highlight many of the atrocities that witnesses and survivors remember from this time. So in village after village, Mayan communities were executed and tortured. Women were subjected to sexualized violence. Young children were murdered in horrendous ways. Pregnant women and their fetuses were tortured and killed. And community members, again, were tortured to such an extent that it made it very difficult for them to survive or lead healthy lives after this violence occurred. So to learn a little bit more about some of the survivor testimony, I'd like to share the work of an anthropologist who is doing fantastic work in Guatemala to remember the victims of these atrocities, but also find justice for them. So I will go ahead and share a clip. We actually had the opportunity to interview a member. He is the executive director of the Forensic Anthropology Foundation of Guatemala. His name is Freddie Petrarelli. So he is actively on the ground in Guatemala, exhuming these mass graves, finding who their family members are to give them a sense of what happened to their family, to give them truth, and supporting them as they seek justice. So in this clip here that I'm going to share, he talks about what it's like working with families and again, the violence that they experienced and how devastating these losses are.
My very first case in 1995, which was Cuarto Pueblo, was during the conflict, and it was in a zone that still had the armed fights. There was still war, and we were there. Like I grew up in New York, and I had just come back to Guatemala, and I really thought, what the hell did I get myself into? I mean, there was mines everywhere. We could hear the fighting at night on the other side of the hill that we were excavating in one valley where there had been a massacre of 424 people, and on the other side of the mountain there was fighting going on every night. And my interaction, the one that I remember, was the first thing I had to do was interview about 50 families. There was only 5 of us then, and we had to set up our camp because this place was I mean, after driving 10 hours, you had to walk another 6 hours in the tropical forest, the jungle, and cross rivers. I mean, I wanted to be Indiana Jones, I thought, and then I was like confronted with the reality of having to do these things that I'd never imagined. And then I was confronted with the reality of what happened, the families. Listening to how, we set up our camp in a former cardamom drying facility that they had there. So they had like cement beams that kind of held up the roofing, and all that had been torn down. So we kind of built it back up so we could have a roof, and we put our tent under there. My tent, I was a new guy, was next to like the outer part, so it was next to one of those beams. And as I was interviewing the families, they kept saying yes. And the children, they would take the children by their arms and legs and they would slam their heads into that beam. And they kept pointing to that beam. That's where my tent was. And they said that there was a puddle of blood, like around the beam. And I couldn't, till now, I slept in that puddle of blood, obviously years later, but oof, that marked me. I mean, probably forever.
So again, we see how devastating and how horrific a lot of the atrocities were occurring against the Mayan community. But I'd also like to share testimony from a Guatemalan survivor that comes from the book Buried Secrets by Victoria Sanford. So the testimony comes from Don Sebastian, who writes about the destruction of his home, his community, and his family. He says, "My house before was built of pure wood. It had 2,300 tiles. Before, there used to be very good wood, cypress. We would walk up into the mountains to bring it down. We thought about the future, but we did not know what was about to happen to us. I worked for the future. Cypress is hardwood to work with because you have to go up far in the mountain and then bring it down, but it is good wood. It will last for more than 100 years. I thought it would be an inheritance for my children. I built my house for the future. If I had known what was going to happen to us, I would not have worked so hard. We did not know that the army was going to come to Azul and burn all of our houses. It brought me great pain to see the foundation of the house I built. It fills my heart with sadness how much it cost me to build this house. I cannot reconstruct this house. I cannot reconstruct my family. What you have come to see is what existed before. You are now witnesses to what happened before. You have seen the bones of our children massacred by the army and the foundations of our burned houses. Before, I used to think that here I would live my future with my children and my grandchildren, but they killed my son and burned my houses. I am old and alone. My grandchildren would be with me, but I don't have them because the army killed my son. So his wife had to find another man because I had nothing to give them. I have nothing." So again, we see very many poignant and heartbreaking testimonies coming from the survivors and witnesses of these atrocities. And I'll mention it towards the end of my presentation, but if you'd like to hear more testimony from Guatemalan survivors, there's a lot of really wonderful resources that you can utilize. For example, there's a great film called Worse Than War by Daniel Goldhagen. It is a PBS documentary, and they are interviewing Mayan community members that were affected by these atrocities. Again, you get the perspective of what was happening to men, women, children, how communities were demolished. You see the exhumation of these mass grave sites, again, in the search for justice and truth. But you also see denial occurring. And so I'll mention that a little bit later on. But you also have the USC Foundation. So they are actually creating testimony of Guatemalan survivors. So you can find their testimonies online for free to learn more about this history and the experiences of individuals that lived through these times. So again, Guatemala continued to experience devastating loss throughout this time period. Although Efraín Ríos Montt was deposed from power, another military dictatorship took over. He still continued to be a presence in Guatemala. So by the end of the Civil War, again, the height of the genocidal atrocities occurred in the late 1970s, early 1980s. About 200,000 victims had been massacred. They have discovered 669 sites of massacre. occur, and about 40,000 people were disappeared, with many of the family members and loved ones still searching for them. So out of all of the victims that were targeted, murdered, and tortured, about 85% of the victims were indigenous Mayans. So again, the targeting of this community based on their identity. We also have 75% of the victims male. So again, kind of highlighting that genocide can also have gender-based violence. So again, the targeting of males because they are perceived to be a threat to the government or their rule. And the Historical Truth Clarification Commission found that about 93% of the atrocities were committed by the government and by its paramilitary, with full knowledge of what was occurring and their support in implementing policies that would destroy these communities. So now I'd like to focus on a post-genocidal society and the search for truth and justice. So there are a lot of great activists and organizations on the ground that are trying to explore this history, again, educating the public about what had actually occurred during this time period, and again, bringing the perpetrators to justice, but also providing families with more information about their loved ones, what happened to them, and seeking justice for the atrocities that had been committed. But unfortunately, denial is still a huge problem in Guatemala. Many of the perpetrators have not been brought to justice, and a lot of the individuals that were responsible for what happening actually say that genocide did not occur, that these deaths were a result of wartime affairs, so it wasn't a targeted campaign of murder. And some people even celebrate their actions during the war. And as I'll talk about a little bit later, some of these military leaders that were responsible for the genocides actually went on to have political careers in Guatemala. But now I'd like to talk a little bit more about the Forensic Anthropology Foundation of Guatemala. As I mentioned before, this is an organization on the ground that applies forensic science to investigate, search, exhume, and identify the victims of Guatemala's internal armed conflict and genocide. So the FAFG supports families in their search for truth, justice, and recovering the remains of their loved ones. And so a lot of the research and work that they do is instrumental in bringing genocide to court and holding these perpetrators accountable. So to learn a little bit more about their work and how they're able to use this evidence in court to kind of lay out the policies and procedures that were used to carry out the murder of these groups, I'd like to go again to Freddie Pecorelli, who is the executive director of FAFG. He highlights how this organization and how communities are banding together to call for accountability and justice in the post-war society.
Guatemala, the families began to form civil society organizations, and they heard of an anthropologist, an American anthropologist that had been to places like Argentina in 1984 or to Chile in 1987. So in 1990, Clyde Snow, whom you see here on the right, who's showing a judge, a justice of the peace, he's actually showing him a bullet inside of that X-ray, and he's beginning to show how to document evidence in the picture on your left. And this is the beginning of the forensic process in Guatemala specific to these crimes. And it's important that we understand that when we are exhuming mass graves of sometimes many years ago, or we're searching for the disappeared, things are a little different. And Clyde, from the beginning, you can see that there is no tape. There's no do not cross crime scene tape. Families are there. They're right next to the graves. He's not wearing protective gear. And this is because Clyde from the beginning understood that he needed to strike a balance between the inclusion of these victims and the scientific effort that needed to go forward. All this done without any support from state agencies. And so Clyde Snow was the person who initially started the forensic anthropology team in 1992, and then eventually we started the FAFG, or the Forensic Anthropology Foundation in Guatemala. I had the privilege of working next to Clyde for about 20 years, and taught me everything from, you know, how to analyze a human skeleton to also how to behave, and how to make sure that the families knew that we were there for them no matter what. And I think that's one of the most important things. Now, during these last many years doing this, I've actually been doing this for about 26 years. Um, we have asked families, you know, what do they expect? And obviously, still today, even though most of these crimes happened 39, 40 years ago, they still expect to find their loved one alive. There's a saying that I've heard almost in every single country that I've worked in. Si vivos se los llevaron, vivos los queremos. If they were taken alive, we want them back alive. And families have taught us that the most important thing to them is to continue searching for them. And they never lose hope that they're going to find them alive. Now, that does not mean that we shouldn't look for the disappeared among the dead. Right? It just means that if we cannot find them alive, then they hope to recover the body. And once they recover the body, then they begin to think about things like truth, you know, what happened to this person? How did they die? Did they suffer? Were they with anyone else? Who killed them? And that's when we get other things like reparations, justice, and hopefully non-repetition. Now, I know these are the pillars of transitional justice, but they are also what the families actually want. So this is one of those times that reality does come off in this methodology, because it was developed through listening to the families. And now what we have to do is make sure that when we implement, when we search and try to identify these victims, that we respect this, and that we understand that we are walking next to families that have been searching for their loved ones for up to 40 years. Now, when we started with forensic anthropology, then forensic archaeology, then victims investigation documentation, and later incorporated forensic genetics, and more recently, we've incorporated confirmation of identification. These are the areas within the FAFG that we use. These are scientific disciplines, some of them. They are very tailored to working with skeletonized remains. And when we work with more recent cases, we obviously include uh, medical doctors or odontologists or fingerprint experts. It really depends on the state of the body. But for us in Guatemala, knowing that all of our cases, most of our cases, um, stem from between 1978 and 1984, then we know we're going to recover dry skeletonized remains. And that's why our main focus is on using forensic anthropology, forensic archaeology to work with the bodies. That's why we have investigators that work with the families, and that's why we have genetics to be able to give us more information that we can compare to try to identify people. Now, what the concept of identification is basically the creation of gathering of information of the person we're looking for. So what we're trying to do is build. The more information we can build on, and the more information we can know about the person or persons that we're looking for, the higher the probability is that we can identify them. And so we try to do the same for the bodies. So there's two sets of information, right? There's the person that we're looking for, and there are the bodies that we are finding. And what we're going to try to do is gather as much information as possible on both of them, so then we can eventually make the match and confirm an identification. So let's see the areas that we work in, right? So the first would be um, the process of documenting and the investigation and documentation of victims. This starts by understanding who we're looking for. Um, Trying to gather as much information as possible about the context of the disappearance, see if there's any information in state archives that might show, as you can see here, that these individuals were being followed and information was being kept on them on secret archives. This is very useful to understand the process, but more useful than that even is to talk to the families. We need to understand who we're looking for. We need to understand if they were, if it was a man, if it was a woman, if they were young, very young, if they were older, how their teeth looked, if they ever had any fractures. So this is the part where we ask about the individual that we're looking for. But also we ask We also ask about the context. When is the last time the person was seen? Who was the person with, etc. And so we're trying to gain as much information as possible. In this part of the process, we're also trying to learn from the person that we're interviewing about the family. Now, it's important to understand about the family because sometimes there's more than one victim. Well, not sometimes, many times there's more than one victim in each family. And we need to understand the relationships among the different victims and also about the living family members that want to participate in the search process, whether it's by giving us information, an interview, or by giving us a DNA sample. So, DNA samples in the past, um, prior to March of last year, were taken by buccal swabs. You can see here that no one's wearing a mask, so you can see this is pre-pandemic. And we used to take buccal swabs, and we would take that buccal swab, rub that Q-tip inside of the mouth for about a minute, each side of the inside of the cheek, and then rub it onto these FTA cards that basically capture DNA. Now we have just transitioned over, same thing, same pretty much the same method, except we're not taking a couple of drops of blood from the hand, from a finger, and placing them on the same paper. But basically, what we're looking for is we're looking for uh, family relations to the victim. So in the best case scenario, mother, father, children, or siblings, brothers and sisters. The more people we can have in the family give samples, the higher the probability is that we're going to find them. We don't talk about just one sample or just two samples. We talk about the just everyone that can contribute. So sometimes we do have a lot of samples from a family, up to 10, but the average is a little higher than two, about 2.5. Um, the next part of the process, so while the investigation is going on, while we are receiving information about the victim, what happened, if they're in archives, taking DNA samples, taking information, we're also looking for bodies. Now, in some cases, families suspect where their loved ones could be buried. In the cases of massacres, they know where they are buried. But in the cases of the disappeared, those bodies are hidden. And so we have to just try to recover as many bodies as possible. And this is very difficult sometimes. Sometimes there's areas, open areas like this. And although there are technological advances like ground penetrating radar and other things that we can use, nothing beats a good old excavation of and not only for finding graves, but you have to remember, families have to trust that we've done everything possible to clear an area so they don't doubt that we've looked there and the loved ones are not there. If we don't do this, the families always doubt that their loved ones could still be in that field and they're going to ask us to come back over and over again. So what we've done is, created a system of a systematic excavation process where we can clear areas and continue to look for graves. Also, as part of the process, the families are there. The families are there. They're witnessing. They're next to the grave, just like you saw in the initial images that I showed you of Clyde Snow in 1990. Well, these are obviously more recent. As we continue to excavate, being very careful, focusing on the body, focusing on the physical evidence, documenting everything along the way, um, informs, taking measurements, three-dimensional images are created. When everything's documented forensically, in other words, everything that we're doing is going to be able to be recreated in a court of law if necessary, or for the families. It's important to remember that when we're excavating one of these graves, we're also destroying the archaeological context, so we have to make sure that we document it properly. Sometimes graves are individual, as the one you saw, and sometimes graves are massive. This is a grave of 64 men. And they can be bigger than this, but you can see how complicated this can be. And we have to go step by step because we have to understand. And you can see things in those images like there's no real order, there's ropes, there's hands behind the back. This tells us a lot of things, and archaeologists are experts in being able to tell, and being able to find these graves and being able to uh, tell us much information from just looking at the graves themselves. You could see in the previous image how there was no water, and you can see how in this one there is specific. Everyone is laying on their backs with their hands. There's a little more respect. Usually, we would say that the previous image you saw, the grave was probably excavated and filled by the perpetrators, and in this one, by people that knew the victims, right? And this helps us also understand how things came to be. Again, always with the families present. Um, Remember, a lot of these graves are in the communities, and they have lived with this um, for many, many years, many decades. So far, the FAFG has conducted over 1,900, close to 2,000 investigations. So each investigation or case can be either one individual, or in the case you see there, that's one grave of 53 of 220 individuals, and even bigger. So these are massive investigations that take a multidisciplinary approach, a lot of trust from the families. Once we have recovered the remains, we bring them back to our forensic anthropology lab or osteology lab, where a process begins of, we take x-rays of every body, we clean the bones, clean the clothing, label every single bone with a case number, and then eventually an anthropologist is assigned a case. The body's laid out, the skeleton is laid out, and we begin the process of analysis where we are going to try to determine two things. One is the biological profile, again, if this is a man or a woman, the age, and the other is trying to understand how they died. So here you can see that it might take days to reconstruct the skull that has been struck, in this case, by a high velocity bullet. Um, it's a high velocity gunshot wound. And what this does is it creates massive destruction of the skull, and we have to hopefully recover it properly, right? We have to make sure that every single one of those fragments is recovered, and not only recovered, but associated to this specific body. And that's why the process of identification with the bodies begins in the excavation, in the field, with the archaeologists. Then it continues here in reconstructing these skulls and trying to understand, because not only is this important forensically and for the investigation, for the criminal investigation, but it's also important for the families. The families want to know what happened to their loved one. And a lot of
So again, you can continue watching the rest of this interview. It is available on our YouTube page, and I can reference it in the resources section. But again, as Freddie Petrelli highlighted, a lot of their work is instrumental in bringing the truth to light and holding the perpetrators accountable. Through their work and the work of activists on the ground, they've discovered sites of execution, of massacres, and through the exhumations, they're able to highlight and reconstruct the crime site to show how these individuals were murdered, again, holding them accountable for the atrocities of perpetrators had committed. Again, that these were purposeful and targeted attacks against the Mayan community, not a byproduct of the war. So again, I'd like to talk a little bit more about what's happening in Guatemala, again, to memorialize the victims and bring the truth to light. So there are a lot of activists and even artists on the ground that are sharing this very important history, again, highlighting the fact that genocide did occur and working towards bringing perpetrators to trial for crimes of genocide. So the artwork that you see here is the work of community members working to memorialize and honor the victims of these atrocities. So in the first picture that you see here, that is art created by Daniel Hernandez Salazar. So he is an artist in Guatemala who uses his art to remember and memorialize the victims of genocide. On a visit with the Forensic Anthropology Foundation of Guatemala, he was witnessing one of these exhumations of individuals murdered in the atrocities, and he actually used the shoulder blades of an individual recovered at this massacre site and positioned the bones behind a young man to create 4 images that you see on the screen here. So the bones are supposed to symbolically represent or resemble angels' wings. So the first 3 images that you see in that graphic allude to see, hear, and speak no evil. And in the 4th image, you can see that the angel is shouting. So Hernandez Salazar has installed his images throughout Guatemala in public places, again, to bring awareness to the atrocities that had occurred there. And Guatemalans have utilized his artwork in protests and marches in which they call for truth, accountability, and justice. So this installation is collectively called Street Angel. And what's interesting is that his fourth image, where the angel is shouting, is titled "So That All May Know," and he has traveled this image to other sites that have experienced genocide and mass atrocities, such as Auschwitz and Hiroshima. And a lot of community members and activists have used these massacre sites, but transformed them into sites of remembrance, again, honoring the lives of their loved ones, and again, sharing the truth with the community and the broader world about what happened there. So the second picture that you see here is one of the memorial sites that was created by the Mayan community in Guatemala. I'd now like to talk about bringing genocide to trial. Many times it's very difficult to bring perpetrators to justice. As I mentioned before, a lot of that evidence doesn't exist. They kind of use the Genocide Convention to their advantage, saying that it doesn't qualify legally as a genocide, saying that these deaths were a byproduct of the war, or that this group is not protected under the Genocide Convention. But in this case, we do see some individuals that have been tried for their crimes. So Efrain Rios Montt, who was referred to earlier, he's the person that you see in the middle here. He was the general during which the height of the genocide occurred between 1982 and 1933. So after he was deposed from his leadership position from the military dictatorship, he continued to remain a public figure within Guatemala and contemporary times. He actually ran for president in 1990 as well as in 2003. He also served several terms in Congress, which actually gave him immunity from prosecution. So he was actually not eligible to be tried for any crimes. But when his last term expired in 2012, he lost that immunity. So in 2013, Efrain Rios Montt was charged with two crimes, crimes against humanity and crimes of genocide, and stood trial in court. But he pled his innocence the whole time, again, using the idea that this was just a byproduct of war. There was no targeted campaign against the Mayans, and it doesn't classify as a genocide. And in May of 2013, after months of trial, Efrain Rios Montt was actually convicted on both counts. He was found guilty of crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity, and he was sentenced to 80 years in prison. So this was a huge watershed moment in history because it marked the first time that a former head of state was prosecuted in its own court system. Unfortunately, 10 days later, this conviction was overturned due to a legal technicality. And a panel of judges actually ordered Rios Montt to face a second trial. So a new trial for genocide was set to begin in 2016, but in the midst of the trial, before the trial could conclude, Rios Montt died of a heart attack at the age of 81. But even though Efrain Rios Montt eluded justice, we do see other individuals that are being tried for the crimes that they had perpetrated there. For example, the picture that you see up at the top is of General Jose Mauricio Rodriguez Sanchez, who was Rios Montt's former intelligence chief, who was also tried alongside Rios Montt in 2013. So he was charged with crimes against humanity and crimes of genocide. He was on trial for his role in his participation in the counterinsurgency plan, in which thousands of indigenous Mayans were killed and the displacement of thousands more during his rule. But in 2018, the court acquitted Rodriguez Sanchez of both crimes, citing that they couldn't prove that he was aware that genocide was occurring and was kind of like going along with that process of systematic destruction. And so you even see in the bottom picture here, indigenous people from the region that was highly impacted throughout this time, holding vigil outside of court, seeking justice, hoping that these perpetrators will be brought to justice. But over the past few years, 18 officers from the 1980s military regime, including a general who was the chief of military intelligence during his time, were also arrested for their alleged involvement in the massacres, forced disappearance, and sexualized violence committed against the Mayan community. Several perpetrators have been found guilty and brought to justice, but of course, the quest for truth and justice continues on to this day. So again, that's kind of like an overview of genocide, but particularly genocide in Guatemala. So if you'd like to learn more about this genocide and the experiences of individuals that lived through this time period, particularly the Guatemalan community, there are a lot of really wonderful resources available that I would highly encourage you to engage with. So first, I referenced this earlier, there is a PBS documentary called Worse Than War that documents genocides, particularly in the 20th century, with a lot of it focused on the genocide in Guatemala. So there are a lot of really great sections that highlight this historical time period, the genocidal plan and policies that were implemented to target the Mayan community, but you're also able to hear eyewitness testimony from Mayan community members that were impacted by that violence, again, highlighting the atrocities and human rights abuses that were committed against them at that time. But what's really interesting about this documentary is towards the end of the film, since it highlights the last stage of genocide, which is denial. As I mentioned earlier, Rios Montt actually went on to serve in the Guatemalan Congress, which he was granted diplomatic immunity, so he could not be tried for his crimes. So the documentarian and scholar, Daniel Johagen, he actually confronts Rios Montt in the Congress and asks him, did genocide occur? And his answer is quite chilling but illuminating, again, really highlighting how denial is a huge present in Guatemala, particularly among the perpetrators. When asked if genocide was committed against the Guatemalan community, he expressed vehemently that genocide did not occur. He actually tried to use the Genocide Convention to his advantage. He states that the genocide couldn't have been committed because the Genocide Convention states in whole that the Mayan community would have need to have been destroyed in whole, but the community still exists. Of course, he's corrected, but he continues to deflect, saying that the Mayan community would not be protected under the Genocide Convention. It was a byproduct of the war, but most chillingly, he says, if I were actually guilty of these crimes, I would already be in court. I would be in jail, kind of provoking the documentarian. And even when he was brought to court, a lot of his supporters were stating genocide did not occur in Guatemala. What occurred was a war. What occurred was a conflict. Many of the survivors are making up their testimony. They're being paid by the opposing groups. So their testimony should be dismissed. Again, this is just a war that happened and not a genocidal plan. So again, denial is still really prevalent in Guatemala, which makes it more difficult to kind of hold perpetrators accountable. But again, it's a testament to the work that activists and scholars are doing on the ground to bring this to justice. If you'd like to learn more about genocide in court, there's also a great PBS NewsHour segment, From Guatemalan Soil, Scientists Unearth Signs of Genocide. So again, it talks about how they use evidence in court to prove genocide happened. So some of the satellite images that you saw earlier were used in the trial of Efrain Rios Montt to highlight these targeted campaigns of murder and destruction. They also use death statistics. So again, statistics that are available within the country to prove that the death rate occurring at that time was related to the genocidal violence. They also use eyewitness testimony and interviews and documentaries that perpetrators themselves participated in. There's also a lot of really great research and books written about this topic. So those books are listed here, as well as autobiographies of Mayans that were impacted by the violence at that time. And for more research, again, the Yale University Genocide Studies program talks about the Guatemalan case. There's a lot of great research available online for free, as well as video testimony of survivors from the USC Shoah Foundation. So again, I hope this can give you an overview of the genocidal atrocities in Guatemala, but hopefully you can go out and learn a little bit more about this very important history and the fight for justice today. But again, thank you to everyone. And if we have time, I'll go ahead and share some of our museum resources after our question and answers conclude.
Fantastic, Lori. Thank you so very much for that presentation. Okay. So we do have some questions for you, Lori. The first is, why did it take so long for Rios Montt to be prosecuted for the crime of genocide?
Nope. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Unfortunately, for many victims and activists that are seeking to bring these perpetrators to justice, it's a really lengthy and difficult process. A lot of it can be attributed to denial. Again, the perpetrator saying that genocide did not occur, that these deaths were accidental or were just a part of warfare and wartime, so it can't be classified as genocide. Is destroyed, which kind of works to their advantage as a way to kind of dismiss the evidence of what had actually occurred. But in some cases, especially in Efrain Rios Montt's case, they're given diplomatic immunity, so they're not able to be tried for their crimes. But again, once his tenure ran out from Congress, he was actually eligible to be tried for his crimes and thankfully was brought to court, although unfortunately he died while the proceedings were taking place. So again, there's still a lot of denial and genocide with his supporters, again, backing up his claims that it was just, again, a byproduct of the war.
Which you elaborate on that and articulate that very well, that immunity that he had. Interesting that he was able to serve in that capacity with his record. Second question is, does the Rios Montt trial set the standard for future prosecutions of genocide?
Yes, I believe it does. Again, this was a really watershed moment. This was the first time in history that a former head of state was actually tried in their own country by their own court system. So again, it shows the activism of community members within that country to bring these perpetrators to justice. So I believe that the precedent that was set there and the system and policies that were created can be replicated elsewhere, and we can hope that we can bring these perpetrators to justice, especially if we have parties that are signers of the Genocide Convention pressuring international leaders, but also leaders within that country to really hold these perpetrators accountable.
Thank you. And third question for us is, why is the Guatemalan genocide lesser known compared to other genocides?
Yeah, that's another great question. Thank you so much. I think a lot of it, like many other genocides, is that denial aspect. So of course, the Holocaust is the most known genocide in history. There's a lot of documentations and records, and Germany has taken steps to reconcile its history. They do label it as a genocide. They educate students from very young ages all the way to adults of the genocide that occurred, and really confront that history. And so I think with other cases of genocide, many of the perpetrators still hold positions of leadership. They still have, I guess, positions of power. And so again, they use that platform to kind of deny that the genocide occurred. There's also owners of that regime or that government of their national partner. But again, I just think that once we have more truth. Once this information is available, that people can learn more about this history, really start to see it in terms of genocidal violence, and educating the public about actions that they can do to support these efforts to find justice and truth on the ground in Guatemala. And I think, yeah, just raising more awareness about it. Again, a lot of this research is still coming out. The Holocaust is almost 100 years out. So again, these are more newer genocides. And again, as more research continues to be produced, we're able to learn even more about this genocide. And again, really have a great understanding of the atrocities that occurred there. So yeah, I think most of it is kind of denial, but some just as research comes out, we are learning more and can be supportive of these communities seeking justice.
Thank you. And lastly, our last question today is, this is an overarching question, but how do we prevent such atrocities from occurring again?
Yeah, that's another really fantastic question. So I think one of the major components of this is education. So educating yourself and the community about what's happening in the world, in your community, in other areas. Again, it might not be impacting you directly, but there are human rights abuses occurring in the world right now. So just learning more about what's happening in the world. For example, there's currently a genocide occurring, which you mentioned at the beginning. So again, finding more information about these atrocities, plugging into organizations that are advocating on behalf of these issues, elevating the experiences of individuals that are being impacted, but also what's really important is getting involved. So getting involved can look a lot of different ways. It can mean donating your time and educating people, sharing news articles about the atrocities happening there. It can be donating money, but also using your voice and your activism within your community. So writing letters or emailing or calling your elected representatives, telling them that you really care about this issue and encouraging them to take a stance and implement policies that will be supportive of those communities that are being targeted. And so if you'd like to learn more about how to educate yourself, again, there's fantastic resources out there. Just one to get you started is the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. They have a website where you can learn more about current genocides and mass atrocities occurring today. You get a great historical background about the actions being committed there. And again, you can start thinking of ways that you can help. We also have Genocide Watch with Dr. Gregory Stanton. He has a website that highlights countries in the world right now that are facing one or multiple stages of genocides or that face warning signs of genocide, so you can learn more about what's happening in those countries. And again, plugging into organizations and NGOs that are working to support those communities being targeted and impacted.
Fantastic, Lori. I just want to say thank you so very much for being with us today. Thank you so very much for all the work that you do at the Holocaust Museum here in Houston and for joining us today. Thank you so very much.
Yes, thank you so much. It's our pleasure. And if anyone needs any support or would like to learn more about the Holocaust or other genocides, especially to promote genocide awareness year round, we have a lot of fantastic exhibits that highlight genocide and human rights issues, ways to get involved, but also a lot of great education resources for students and teachers that are free of charge. To again, really educate the future and the public about these very important topics, but also reimagining how we can use our voices and actions today to be supportive and prevent these atrocities from continuing to occur. So again, thank you all so much for the invitation to be a part of this very special day of remembrance and commemoration.
That brings a close to our event today. Thank you everyone for watching, and let's keep informed and keep an eye out. Lori, again, thank you one more time.
Yes, thank you so much.